Okay, good morning, everybody. So our topic today, it's interesting how this topic came about. I have a list, I have a spreadsheet of all the topics that I want to cover throughout the school year, and I map it out so that way we know what's coming up and like making sure that we're covering everything. And I actually had like this like empty week, and it was this week. And so I was at home and I was looking over this and I showed it to my daughter and I'm like, well, hey, you are a recently graduated from high school person. Looking at this, what would be something that parents should know about that I haven't covered this year? And so she looked at the list and she's like, you haven't talked about gender and sexuality. And I'm like, no, I haven't. And actually, we've never done this topic. It came from, she's my go-to member of Generation Z and like, what are the kids talking about these days? So she's the one that came up with this. So hopefully you guys enjoy this topic. Hopefully it's very educational and that you learn a lot. That's our goal today, is to just educate parents and to know what different terms are and what things mean, and definitely lots of time to answer your questions too. And so hopefully we'll have some discussion where you guys have a lot of questions. All right, Miss Marshall is the one joining me today. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yes, as one of the newer staff members, I was really excited about this. This is my first year at Piedmont, but last year I was working with LGBTQ foster youth. So I think this is a fabulous topic, and I think more specifically, I was working with people's parents last year and kind of how to make sure it was a easy transition for them, as parents had a lot of questions and probably a lot of concerns sometimes about what their future might look like. Sometimes people are across the board on what they know and how they feel about it. So I want this to be like a non-judgmental space. If you have questions, there's no question too like basic. There's no opinion that I don't want to hear. So feel free to share. Happy to talk about it. I'm going to share my screen. I just have a couple slides that would just be like a nice little guide. I think I can, oops, not that share. Slideshow. Does this look right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. One of the terms that I've come to use more often is called Soji. It's not always used, and it doesn't mean that you have to use it, but it was kind of helpful for me. It stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and then expression. And we can kind of talk about how these are all different things and how they all come together. But excuse me. Yeah, it's just a helpful term because, the best way to put it is like we all have a Soji, whatever that is. We all have a sexual orientation. It's not just people who identify as gay or bisexual or anything else. We all have a gender identity, not just people who are transgender, even if you like relate closely to the gender you were assigned at birth. And we all express these things in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, let's just get started. These are just kind of a breakdown of those terms. Again, feel free to like put any questions, or if I need to move along, let me know. But when we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about any kind of like emotional, romantic, or like even physical attraction. For people, that's usually over an extended period of time. And it doesn't mean it is distinct from people's like sexual behavior. So I want to like make that differentiation, because people might, like date certain people. That doesn't mean that's always the person they're attracted to or their sexual orientation. I think we see this often, like, let's say like a young woman is like seriously dating men all the time, but still identifies as bisexual or even a lesbian. It doesn't mean that they can't self-identify their sexual orientation just because of who they're with. or who they've been with. And I think I'm going to take a step back because I just want to acknowledge, I think some of the discomfort sometimes around talking about this, especially with young people and with kids, is that we're talking about also sexual attraction, and which includes seeing them as like sexual beings, which is like kind of uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable. Usually some families don't get to talk about sex life and attraction and all that. And I think sometimes we can like step away from it, which is okay. It's whatever that works for that family dynamic. But I just want to acknowledge that can be like an uncomfortable part about talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, and all that. Yes. So that includes sexual orientation. And I want to separate, there can be like physical attraction and there can be like romantic attraction. And sometimes those can be different. Sometimes people are romantically attracted to one type of person. Sometimes they're physically attracted to the other type of person. And I want to like put all this out there just because this is what students are learning about too. So when they are talking about all this, we'll have a better idea of like how to talk about it with them. So sexual orientation, I think, is like one of the main things that people think about when they think about like the LGBTQ community, but gender identity is also an equal part in that. And one's gender identity is like their internal view of how they represent their gender. It's a spectrum. I'll say that. I think we usually kind of see like man on one side, woman on one side. I'll use the term non-binary, and when we look at man and woman, that's kind of like a very binary gender spectrum, right? There's like one or two options. Non-binary is a term that I think a lot more youth are using, or that they at least know about. And that's a term that kind of means someone who maybe doesn't really identify within one type of man or one type of woman, somewhere in the middle, maybe somewhere not even related to that. Yes. Jenny, feel free to jump in anytime. If you have any questions, I don't want to just like take away. But yeah, I'll keep going. And feel free to ask any questions along the way. And I want to separate gender identity is different than the sex we're assigned at birth. Because the sex we're assigned at birth is usually based on, like when someone's born, like their genitals that the doctor sees, or even before that, when people, have like gender reveal parties, it's kind of based on the hormones that they can kind of detect during pregnancy. So usually, there's male and female. There's also intersex, which can be any kind of combination of different external organs, internal organs, chromosomes, hormones, etc. This is intersex, I think, is a topic, again, that is coming up more for younger people. So again, this is just kind of my way of putting it out to parents that this is something that kids are talking about more. I think we've had a lot more conversations about how doctors have handled this in the past. And, usually when a baby comes out and maybe their genitalia is kind of ambiguous, they'll kind of, push it one way or another. Maybe they'll make even physical changes to the baby, which has come out later within this like LGBTQ community as pretty harmful. It leads to a lot of discomfort and issues for people if they, find out that their genitalia was one way and their gender identity didn't match. And that was kind of a decision that was made for them and not with their consent. So I wanted to separate gender identity and sex assigned at birth because, usually we see that align, like someone born female identifies as a woman or vice versa, male and identifies as a man. And sometimes it doesn't go together. Someone's born in a body that does not fit their gender identity. This kind of last one, gender expression, is one that I think is almost the most important because this can look a lot of different ways. It's just the way that someone can like communicate, can show off their gender, and that can be through their behavior, their like mannerisms, their clothing, their hairstyle, voice, etc. It's kind of anything across the board about how you present, and that's just how we express it. And it doesn't indicate someone's gender or their sexual orientation. You know, someone, I'm going to use myself as an example. Some days I dress pretty feminine. I think today I'm pretty feminine. I'm wearing makeup. I've got my hair straightened. I got necklaces, jewelry, cheetah print, things that are typically seen as pretty feminine or seen with women. Some days I have my hair pulled back, or maybe in the past years I've had completely shaved head, wouldn't wear makeup, you know, wear maybe clothes from the men's section. And right, that kind of helps with seeing that as something more fluid, but I just want to use that as an example because it doesn't necessarily indicate someone's gender, just how they dress or their sexual orientation. I think, again, the younger generation is paving the way as, you know, I see more young boys, you know, more comfortable in dresses and skirts and wearing nail polish, wearing makeup, kind of experimenting with beauty and what that looks like for them. But
I think that you just made like an important point that it doesn't, how they express themselves, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their sexual orientation. And I think that one thing, you know, and I think most of the parents are the same age as me, you know, probably late 40s. You know, we're solidly Gen X, like that. Like, I think that we just grew up, growing up at a time where, you know, sexual orientation was becoming more and more accepted, especially if you grew up in the Bay Area like I did. You know, this is a fairly liberal area. A lot of this is, you know, accepted, but I think still in our society, we have definite like, oh, if you dress this way, this means that's your sexual orientation. And I think that one thing that's really changing now, especially with this younger generation and the kids that are in high school now, is it's not necessarily true. The way they express themselves does not necessarily mean anything about their sexual orientation at all.
right. I like that. And I think that's something that I hear from students when we talk one-on-one is maybe like some conflict with their parents sometimes is that they're like, well, I just want to try this out, but I don't want to, you know, have my parents make assumptions about me and I think from parents' side, I would imagine is just a natural curiosity about what's happening and if there's noticeable changes, you know. But yeah, I'll keep going. I liked this graphic. I like anything rainbow, basically. So the other term that I usually use is just LGBTQ, and then I usually say plus because how can we say all these letters and not trip up? Everyone kind of says it differently. Some people say LGBTQIA, but this is just a short little acronym that kind of encompasses a lot more about sexual orientations and gender identities. So for those who don't know, you know, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender are that LGBT. That Q, I think it used to mean more questioning. I think now it's kind of meaning queer more often. And I'll highlight that too. Queer is kind of used as an umbrella term more than a derogatory term more often now. I think older generations have heard it as like a slur, and younger generations are kind of reclaiming it more and using it for themselves in a non-derogatory way. Although any word could still be used, you know, with some like malintent, but I don't want to alarm anybody if they hear their kids using that. Oops, sorry, I have a call. I'm just gonna ignore it. But this is, you know, I think we should be pretty common with or comfortable with like the terms lesbian, gay. I think those are pretty common terms. Bisexual, you know, usually means some type of attraction to this kind of both genders if we're just talking about men and women. Um, oop, got that call again. Now I'm thinking about it. So these first three are kind of talking just about sexual orientations. When we talk about transgender people, we're talking about people whose like gender identity internally doesn't match their like physical sex assigned at birth. And maybe somewhere in between, right? That transgender is another kind of, oh my gosh, they're calling me again. I'm gonna hope that they leave me a message. Yeah, sorry about that. What terms, Jenny, do you feel like are more common versus newer or not really used at all?
It's interesting. Well, so I guess I'll share personal with my poor daughter. I talk about her all the time. She's cool with it, I tell her. So my daughter, when she was a sophomore in high school, I actually asked her if she liked girls because I could just see her struggling with the idea of dating and boys. And so like one day I just like asked her, I'm like, Hannah, do you even like boys? And she's like, I don't think I do. And it was like this whole thing. And I was fine with it and just very like, okay. And so but then at different periods, so she has had a girlfriend, and at different periods, she has dated boys. Like right now she's going through a boy phase where she's dating boys. And so like not too long ago, I asked her, I'm like, so do you think you're identifying like as bisexual or pansexual? And she was like, I just don't think I'm going to do labels. And I think that that's also very common of this generation, that they were like, why do I need to have this label? I'm just going to be. And I'm like, well, you just be, that's fine. I think that it's more us that are older and parents that we more need the label. We need to like, kind of like, oh, what box are you going to go in? But one thing that I want to like tell parents and like why we're sharing all this, your kids are very aware of all of this. My son, for example, when my daughter came out and we had these conversations, like, and we like, my poor son, like we don't, because he's always on his iPad doing his thing. And I feel like he's not really paying attention. And we certainly haven't, in like when he was a kid, necessarily talked to him about all of this. Like I would like to think that he knows that we're an open and accepting family, but we haven't certainly like discussed all of like these like labels and what they mean. But then he told us one day, he's like, I think I'm asexual. And we had never had a conversation about what asexual means, but it's something that he saw on YouTube. Like he's been exposed to it. So I want parents to know, like, I think as parents, we need to know what all of this stuff is because our kids certainly do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Just because I think this is a generation that just because parents aren't teaching them doesn't mean they're not going to learn about it. So at least we'd want to know what they're talking about. So I think that's a great term too, asexual. I think even fluctuating between these, like you mentioned, like students who don't really want to use labels. I think that's just so fabulous. I think that's the kind of like where we wanted to be, where we wanted to go as like a society, just to not have labels. I remember I'm like late 20s and I remember feeling really good when I finally found a label that worked for me, and to just eliminate that whole process and not even have to worry about like, am I bisexual? Am I lesbian? Am I straight? And then not even have to do those little hoops and jumps, and just to be and exist how you are. It's very exciting. Happy for this like younger generation. But yeah, and I just also want to highlight kids who are going through this, who are kind of exploring this, they might find a term that works for them, and then that might change. And I also want to acknowledge it doesn't mean it's a phase. It doesn't mean like that what they're going through or what they're feeling isn't valid or real. Just means like maybe trying, I kind of talk about it as like trying on a shirt, you're trying on different terms, and does this fit? Maybe that shirt fits for a little bit and then you don't like it anymore. Maybe you grow out of it or something.
Yeah, I always like to think of it as like kind of their present truth. Like
Mhm.
it's like where they're at right then. And I think that's true for all of us. Like if I look back in my life and like different things and like things I felt about myself and like, people I was attracted to and like, how I viewed things. I am 48 years old. I have changed. So
Yeah,
I think that that's, definitely true for everybody.
right. I like that. I don't know why these little titles that I made are all squishing together, but I just wanted to acknowledge why we're talking about this. And Ginny, you just mentioned this, like they know about this. They are probably more informed than we are talking about this. They're way more ahead of the game. There's terms that they know about. There's, theories and etc. But I just thought this was interesting. If you're familiar with Gallup in their kind of national surveys, they do they collect a lot of data, but this was the percentage of each population from each generation that identified as like part of the LGBTQ community. So baby boomers, it's pretty low, 2.6%. And I also want to acknowledge probably why it was lower for the older generation. I know, a lot of discrimination and a lot of discrimination and kind of hate came out of, different periods of time, even with, the AIDS epidemic and everything like that, that we might not see older generations of LGBTQ community. But just we see each generation, there's more and more people. It's like doubling. I wouldn't be surprised if the next generation's at like 40 or 50%. Don't want to also make it sound like something in the water is turning these children gay. But just acknowledging that with more information, with more knowledge, with more exposure, people become more comfortable with it being more mainstream, with like commercials having, LGBTQ couples, people just knowing and talking about it more. I think everybody has like a story about that one aunt that kind of like has this like long-term roommate, but acknowledging like she's part of the family, except, so I think a big thing came out, especially in my work last year, working with LGBTQ kids and their families. A lot of questions were about like, is it TikTok? Were you pressured by like social media to like be this way, or is it like cooler to be this way? And of course, like you mentioned, Ginny, like it's their truth in that moment. It's their truth like in this time in their life. I would assume that just exposure, just learning about terms earlier, learning that it's okay to be a certain way or express yourself in a certain way, just knowing that that's okay, knowing that's accepted, you're going to see a lot more people being more open about who they are. Because when I look at these numbers, I don't see that there's more people. I just see that there's more people who are open to talking about it. I don't know if Ginny, you've been here a lot longer. Have you seen bigger trends or?
Definitely. I'm seeing like, yeah, where it's just more accepting and just not even, and like I said, this has always been a fairly acceptable area. And I'm because I used to teach at Piedmont Hills before, I left and I came back as an administrator. So I would say that one thing is, kids are a lot more comfortable being open with like, holding hands and like walking down the hallway with the same sex partner. It's a very, and I love it. It's a very accepting campus. And I wouldn't say it's just here. I think that that's just a trend and the way things are. And I think that kids are just a lot, kids, teenagers now are just a lot more comfortable with, this sort of thing. Another little story, I had to kind of get on ASB. I think this was homecoming where they had, spirit days, and they had one day that was supposed to be a gender swap, and I had to like, that's a bad idea. That will make some, we have some transgender students that would feel uncomfortable with that, and they were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like we didn't like think of that. And they were really embarrassed and like quickly changed it and came up with a new theme, and they were awesome about it. Like it was not a thing, but like,
I love that.
what was great is when I was, talking about this at home with my husband, who also is an administrator, and we're in this, when you have a spouse that does the same job, you talk about work a lot. So we were talking about my son, who is in the 7th grade, was like, why would they think that's a good idea? He's like, that's terrible. And I was like, oh, go Nathan.
Nathan's just way ahead of the game.
Nathan is. He's pretty, he's pretty good.
It's always those quiet ones. You think they're not paying attention. They're just absorbing everything, and they have these like really brilliant opinions. Yeah. That's very cool. Yeah, I think we're very lucky to be in the Bay Area. I think that's a kind of different culture than some different parts of the country, but also the generation, everything's just changing. Yeah, I think I wanted to add these are a little bit kind of scary statistics, but I think this is exactly why we're talking about it more, why it's become more important to talk about LGBTQ issues and things along those lines, because we've seen just bigger issues across the board for these youth. And it's not because of who they are, it's because of how the world kind of treats them. My whole job last year of working with LGBTQ youth and their families, it was specific to their relationship and being involved with CPS. And I think all of foster youth and homeless youth is about 50% LGBTQ youth. I think that's just wildly important if they're, about 20% of the population, but 50% of the kids who are homeless or involved with the system. I think that says a lot. So I'll talk about pronouns on the next slide, but this first part, transgender and non-binary youth who reported having their pronouns respected by all the people they lived with attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have that. And I think that's just like a staggering statistic, just on this next little part, because 52% of transgender or non-binary people, non-binary youth, 52% will attempt suicide at some point. And that's just a wildly high number, and it doesn't have to be that high. And especially if we know that just using the name and pronoun that they want us to use, just using that proper term cuts that number in half. That's kind of the easiest thing we can do. And it's kind of that basic level of respect. And I think this other number of 42% of all LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And it's just so high. I think me and, Yvonne Gunter, we talk about this all the time, and especially with all the other social workers in the district. I don't know how the past years have been, but I know that this year, suicidal thoughts are really high with students. Not that they're always attempting suicide, but just the thoughts are quick and they come really fast, and it's kind of alarming how common they are. It's like, it's one of my most like sensitive spots, is just because it's such a heavy thought, and for them to be going through it every day is probably excruciating when they're are expected to focus on subjects like math or history, and all they can think about is, not being here. It's very scary for me. And with the amount of youth that we see, amount of people, if we know like what we can do to change that number, and it's something as small as like name and pronouns, I think that's the reason why we're kind of talking about it today, is because these little things we might not realize have the biggest impact. Yeah, I'll keep going. 75% of the youth reported that they've experienced some type of discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, at least once in their lifetime. Dang, I'm getting another call. Now I'm a little worried. I think that's also an important number. And discrimination can look like anything between, how teachers treat them or family treats them, friends treat them, people at the store, etc. And this last one was like very shocking that 94% of LGBTQ youth reported that recent politics have negatively impacted their mental health. And I don't know if y'all keep up with what's been happening. I think the latest one of like Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, where I think that bill, apologies if this isn't correct, I think the bill was about having no type of mention about sexual orientation, gender identity, anything like that in elementary school. Jenny, do you know?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And we know what kind of harm that can cause just by hearing through students. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that if we don't talk about it, then we'll be able to like save that conversation for when it's like ripe for their age and they'll be able to handle that conversation in a better way. Or they'll be able to decide it for their own. But they're always, like you mentioned, even with Nathan, like they're always getting that information from somewhere. So
yeah, I don't normally watch Dancing with the Stars, but I did this past season, mostly because I don't know, some people know about my Peloton obsession. So my favorite Peloton instructor was on Dancing with the Stars, which is why I watched it. But if you know, there was Jojo Siwa was same-sex couple dancing, and my daughter made a comment. She's like, wow, if I had seen something like this when I was a little kid, this would have meant so much to me. And I was like, wow. And I just didn't realize, even like with her, because, she has an accepting family, and like, we were totally like, when she came out, like open arms, like, no issues at all. But just that, she still felt like she wanted like representation, and to see that and have people talk about that and how much that would have meant to her. So that was, really impactful to me, that, I think that as a society, we need to do more, and representation does matter. It's really important.
Oops, sorry for freezing. It was one of those moments where you had stopped talking.
I was pondering what I had said really hard.
Okay, good. Sorry, I couldn't play it off better. But yeah, I think that's a good point, because we assume like they're not maybe getting like hateful messages through the TV, but everything that they're seeing is usually like heterosexual couples. They're not seeing themselves. Or cisgender people, they're not seeing themselves. I had a kid talk to me once about, it's like can be the smallest things that they're noticing, they're observing. And he mentioned that he's like, I could never come out to my parents because they just do little things. Like if, someone comes on the TV, they change the channel. Or if like a same-sex couple's on TV, they change the channel. And it's, I don't know if that is, their preference. They didn't want to see that couple, or if they just wanted to watch something different. There's very real possibilities there, but they're just observing all the time and noticing every little thing. So I think us talking about it more, adults talking about it and opening up the conversation, like you mentioned, Jenny, just being like, hey, is it possible you don't like boys? Kind of gives them an opportunity to share. And if any parents like have any comments on that, how it's been at your house or how it's been avoided, that's okay too. I'd like to hear from you all too. Oh, there is a beautiful, I'm going to read this comment out loud. I'm against discrimination of any type, and I have no objection to the way people decide their gender, except the society is not fully ready for this yet. And we should all try to help create a new infrastructure to ease the transformation. such as trans having the third group for sports competitions and third assigned restroom gender areas. It's not fair, even moral, to a large population to use the same restrooms being used or competing with especially female genders assigned at birth. I think you bring up another one of those kind of legislations. I think it was maybe in Texas, talking about, separating transgender people, transgender kids in bathrooms. Maybe you could elaborate too on your comment, but the separation in bathrooms and in sports, it can look really different. I've even seen some kind of joke posts about it where there will be like female Olympic athletes, obviously they're super buff and just, they're tall, thick, they're, just monster tree people. And people commenting about them being transgender, and they're completely not transgender, but they just have, different genetic abilities, different like levels of testosterone naturally occurring. I think it is a big concern for people at times, thinking about, they're like worried about the fairness of that. I think, it can be one of those topics where it's of my personal belief that it's not as big of an issue as people assume it is, considering how low of a percentage of the population is actually transgender. I think it's like closer to 1%. And then if we think about the amount of kids who actually play sports, and same with concern about bathrooms. I know there's a big concern about people using different bathrooms around, that, they might be trying to sneak into the girls' bathroom or something. But I know on the flip side of that is a lot of transgender students will hold their bodily functions all day. They actually have a lot of health complications because they're holding it to avoid the bathrooms. I don't know, Jenny, if we've had more conversation about bathrooms too at school more recently, but if you have any like comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's California law that, all schools have to have gender neutral bathrooms, and we do. Unfortunately, we only have really one. There will be another one when we build our new performing arts building. But yeah, it's difficult. I mean, and it's, a lot of times with schools, like you want to have space for transgender students to be comfortable and not feel, you don't want them to feel uncomfortable. You want them to be able to obviously go to the restroom, change in the locker room. This is just local issues that we're dealing with. Like we have a gym and locker rooms that were built in the 1960s, and they're not equipped for, separate non-gendered locker room space. And so we do the best we can. I don't think we have the greatest solutions. I wish we had better solutions. I think that this is just, my priority is always the students and making the students feel comfortable. And yeah, so.
Thank you. I turned my video off just because I was freezing a bunch. So I'll leave it off just for a second, but I'll keep going. But yeah, I think talking about it in schools is a huge conversation, and I welcome all opinions still. But again, we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and that everyone feels safe at school, including our transgender students. I wanted to include a slide about pronouns. I don't know if this has come up for any parents or if they have big questions about it. I know, usually when people learn about it for the first time, there's a lot of big questions and there's a lot of mistakes. I know I made 1.5 million mistakes as people have, corrected me on their pronouns. I think our common like English language tells us that she is for girls, he is for boys, they is only to be used for more than one person. I'm going to turn my video back on, see how well it goes. more students are using pronouns they, them to describe themselves just as an individual. I think this is a pronoun that kind of encompasses that transgender, non-binary area where maybe they don't necessarily feel like a boy, maybe not necessarily feel like a girl, somewhere in the middle, somewhere kind of in a different plane. And these are small ways that we can kind of tell them that we see them, tell them that we like see what they're going through, see and respect like where they are in that process. I know it can be kind of tricky, and it's totally okay to make mistakes, but I think the important part when we talk about using the correct pronouns for someone, like assuming that we make a mistake, accidentally calling someone he when they prefer they. I think the best practice for that is just to say, oops, I'm so sorry, and keep going. Especially as we're learning, we want to, justify our actions and say, oh God, I'm so sorry. It's so hard for me. And, this isn't how I was raised. This isn't how I learned it in English class, blah, blah, blah. I've heard time and time again for kids and from just people who use different set of pronouns that just, if you could correct yourself or correct yourself the next time, that's the easiest way to go about it. I think, especially during distance learning, I heard a lot. Again, I was working with LGBTQ youth during like the main distance learning part. And, a lot of students would have their pronouns in their name. And I asked one student about like how much of their class used, we call them like an assorted pronoun. So maybe they use she and they. And they said about like 80% of the class was using some type of like mix of pronouns. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's wild. That's a wild number, just because one, if we don't ask, we don't know, right? Like we can often assume that people use different pronouns than they actually would like us to use. I know it's a big question, and just I want to highlight that point on the last slide, that using the pronouns that someone wants us to use can cut like suicidal thoughts in half. And it seems very small, seems like a small gesture, but it has a big impact. Jenny, I don't know if you see this at school more often. I know we don't. Some teachers kind of ask in the beginning of the year, which pronouns can I use for you, or which name can I use for you?
I love it when teachers do that. I think it's a really good practice. I think it just can make such a difference with a student, and they're feeling accepted and welcoming in a classroom when a teacher says, like, what pronoun should I use for you? Even if they think it's obvious, because you never know. And because again, like we talked about, like your gender identity and like your expression does not necessarily, correlate. And so don't make assumptions. I think it's really important. And I think this is also something that's changing over time. I remember it's probably about 6 years ago. I was at a different school. An English teacher emailed me. It's like, oh, I had this incident in class today, with so-and-so that was a transgender student at the school I was at, because we were talking about grammar rules for the English language. And, we may want to use they, but what's really grammatically correct is to use she and him. And I had to be like, well, this so-and-so, not going to use names. That's actually changed because I also am a super huge nerd. And so I was listening to this podcast. I literally was listening to a grammar podcast. I'm a giant nerd. But they were talking about how the style guide that actually sets the English language usage for like journalists and like what's accepted usage just changed that rule. And so now they is accepted and it is proper English and it's grammatically correct. And so
that's amazing. I didn't know that they like changed those rules, and which makes sense. I think the other example that I've heard is, let's say you're like, oh, so and so called for you, and you go, oh, what did they say? What did they want? We kind of already use it in some ways, but that's really interesting that you're gonna have to drop the link to the grammar podcast. I love that. That's really cool. Again, any like questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I feel like pronouns can usually bring up a lot of questions, a lot of opinions. So feel free to add those. I wanted to add, I realize we have about 10 minutes left. So I just wanted to add these last couple slides about like what to do when they do talk to you about it, or maybe you found out and they have not talked to you about it. Just a couple things just to remind them. A lot of times I think parents, we assume that they know these things, and we think that they don't need to hear them, but they definitely do need to hear them. Because what I hear on the other end is that they're like, they don't support me, they don't love me. And then I get on the phone with a parent, and the parent's like, I love them so much, I want to support them, I want to see them happy. And I'm like, okay, how do we like connect these two? How do we like remind the kids that their parents are there, they're in their corner, they want the best for them, they would just want a happy life for them, right? I don't think it can be said enough, just like I love you no matter what, or I accept you no matter what. Whether it feels redundant or whether it feels like something you've told them a million times, if they talk to you about it, just reminding them that you love them, trust them no matter what. Thanking them for trusting you, because it is something that does require some trust to talk about. Because, like we kind of mentioned, in the world, when you come out, sometimes you don't get very warm, welcoming reactions. Sometimes you're faced with, a lot of negative things. Every time a kid brings it up to me, I thank them for trusting me with it and who I can talk to about it. And I don't think it could be understated, like, how can I support you with this? Especially if like you're not part of that LGBTQ community yourself, like how can I help from the outside, or just as a support for you? Jenny, it sounds like you guys kind of handled it.
Yeah, and what I want to add to this, I love, especially with how I can support you. And one thing is like, if it's your child, like how can you support them with coming out to the rest of the family? So my daughter came out, like she came out to my husband and I, but we didn't tell my parents for like another year. And she wanted to do it herself, and just like when the time was right. She picked Thanksgiving like 2 years ago. And it was a super awkward moment, and my parents didn't handle it well. They baby boomer and older, my dad's like in his 80s, generation it wasn't ugly, but they just like didn't react, like, which was almost kind of worse, because they just kind of like paused and then immediately changed the subject. And it was hurtful to my daughter. And so I wish, like, if there's anything I could go back and change, I wish I had like talked to her that I was going to like tell them first, and like I could like be like, this is how you need to react, and like, this is what you need to do to support her. I think when you're talking about like grandparents and people that are older than us that really don't know how to handle this, that might be helpful, because that's something that I wish I had done better.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense, because sometimes that initial reaction can be probably not really representative of how they feel, but it's like, shock. And exactly. That makes total sense. And also doing that like with them, like, can I tell grandma and grandpa first, or making sure they're okay with that too.
Yeah.
But I think that's number 5 was kind of my favorite to add, because I, even just in the world, in the realm of life, I react to things totally how I don't want to react to things, even though I know how I should react to things. But it does not hurt at all to go back and say, I'm sorry, I didn't handle it how I would have liked to. Like, this is, just kind of correcting whatever little wrong happened, or, maybe you stepped on a toe. metaphorically. This next slide was, oops, go back one. I wanted to add just things to kind of avoid as well. The ignoring it part. If whether, if you don't want to talk about it, or if you think like, oh, they'll come out to me later, or they'll bring it up when they want to again. Sorry, someone's knocking at my door. Ignoring it can send a different message than we want to give. I'm so sorry, someone's knocking. Is it okay if I go pop over?
Sure, we can actually probably wrap this up because we're about out of time.
Okay. Sorry.
So yeah, I would just, these are important things to, what not to do. Overall, like just, and again, the reason we wanted to talk about this is stuff that your kids are talking about, and you should know like what they're talking about. And like, it may not be your child that's, has a different than normal sexual orientation or gender identity. It may be their best friend, it may be, a different family member. It's, probably like everybody is going to be exposed to this, in some way. And so just knowing all of this, hopefully this can start a good conversation. And definitely if you need help with how to be supportive of your child, that's what we're here for.
Definitely feel free to reach out. The last slide I wanted to add, it was just a couple of resources, and we can send these out to everybody.
Yeah, Kayla, if you'll just send me the presentation, I'll send it out with the video.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you everyone for having us.
Yeah, thank you, because people are trying to get a hold of Kayla desperately. So.
I know. Okay, I'll be good.
But thank you everybody for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Next week, we're talking about one of my favorite topics to talk about, and how to teach your child to fail, which is what we don't normally think about what we should teach them. But that's what we'll talk about next week. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.